Hello, welcome. This is Rob Gramlich with the Americans for a Clean Energy Grid webinar on the anniversary of FERC Order 2000. We are allowing people to join here. It looks like the numbers are coming in fast and furious, so we're going to wait another minute until people are on. Hello, welcome again. This is Rob Gramlich, and you're on the Americans for a Clean Energy Grid webinar celebrating 20 years of Order 2000 and regional transmission organizations. Thank you all for joining. We've got a very large number of folks on there appropriately, given our excellent panelists. We have 4 former FERC chairs joining us today. The agenda is we're going to have each of the 4 give about 5 minutes on their perspective on RTOs, kind of past, present, and future, and then have some dialogue. You can ask questions. We welcome that through the webinar software, and we'll be looking at those. I'm joined here by Isabel Harrison with David Gardner and Associates, who also supports Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, and we'll be looking at those questions as they come in. For more information on Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, look on the website. The link there is should be shown on the screen. And I would also note there was a press release we put out in December on this topic, and we had some quotes from the current 4 panelists as well as 3 others, former chairman Bay, Aber and Kelleher. So they are also with us in spirit, but 4 was enough for one webinar. Maybe we'll do this again. Anyway, you can look at their comments there on the website. So with that, why don't we go to the next slide, and I'll introduce the panelists. We're going to start with Jim Hecker, who is actually on the board of directors of Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, and he was FERC chairman from 1997 through 2001. We'll move then to Pat Woods, who was my boss and FERC chairman 2001 to 2005, and then move next to John Wellinghoff, who was chairman 2009 through 13. And then wrap it up with Cheryl LaFleur, chairman in the 14-15 timeframe, acting chairman 13-14 and 17, and commissioner through a lot of basically the last decade. So again, we'll do them in series from first to last. And why don't we move on to the next slide? And start the opening with Jim. If you're there, if you don't mind kicking us off and give us a little bit of a walk through history lane. You're a historian after all, on Order 2000 and what it was. We've got the characteristics and functions up on the screen. Why did you do it? What was the thinking around those times? And then share your own thoughts on what it's accomplished over the years.
Well, thanks, Rob. I'm really pleased to be on here with my fellow chairs and you. The Order 1000 rulemaking was historic, but it was one of a series of major rulemakings and policy makings that happened in the 1990s that continue to shape how electricity markets operate today. I think what we were trying to accomplish in December of 1999 was to eradicate remaining undue discrimination in rates and planning of transmission. It gave an institutional form to the work that was done by Order 888, which was to provide open access and non-discriminatory access to the electric transmission system. The interesting thing is that Order 2000 had some significant antecedents, and we had concluded that we needed to eliminate some remaining uncertainties, the potential for pancaking rates and so forth. But remember that the old power pools have been around since World War II in some cases. That Order 888 had itself outlined 11 criteria for regional grid management. The FERC had required participation in some form of regional transmission organization as a condition of some mergers. But we looked at the system as it was evolving, new competitive markets, and decided to impose some structure on it. And Order 2000 turned out to be voluntary. That wasn't going to be my preference, but we still, I think, put out some benchmarks in the form of these characteristics and functions that were extremely important to establishing workable markets. RTOs were to be independent, that is, transmission was not going to be operated purely in the interest of jurisdictional transmission owners. And so control, planning of the grid was going to be transferred to the RTOs. The scope of its operation was to mimic regional market configurations, and the RTOs, I think, were to take on some important functions that they have to this day. What we had contemplated in 1999 was something that was pretty simple and straightforward. I think the RTOs have evolved since then. I'm sure we'll be talking about how they have begun to help design and operate regional markets for bulk power that are a lot more complicated and a lot more sophisticated than we thought about 20 years ago. But Order 2000, essentially the Commission concluded that Order 2000 needed to be an institutional framework for emerging competitive markets. And it was a benchmark that made further changes possible. Thank you, that's a good slide there. As my colleagues will tell you, the qualities, characteristics, and functions that RTOs manifest have evolved in ways that I'm extremely proud to have participated in the creation of this style of bulk power market.
Great, thank you, Jim. And yeah, the benefits are shown on the screen as articulated by the Commission at that time. So why don't we'll keep moving and come back to some of those points, and now talk with Pat Wood, who was chairman of 2001 to 2005, and I was extremely proud to work for Pat at that time. And we see on the screen here RTOs covering quite a bit of the the country. Pat, at the time you came in, there were some ISOs in a couple of places, but you oversaw this pretty dramatic expansion across what became about 2/3 of the country. Do you want to talk about that first, and then tackle some of the market design aspects, which we'll also show a slide on?
You bet, Rob. Thanks, and the pride goes both ways. Proud to have you on my staff. So Jim was Moses. He got to see the promised land. I was Joshua, who actually got to walk through the muck to get into it. So in 2001, we had a raft of Order 2000 filings. This summer, we were also dealing with the California energy crisis. But in parallel, we were moving ahead with the rest of the country, dealing with a raft of filings. And these filings were all over the map. I think, let a million flowers bloom kind of became an operative aspect there, but some were too small in scope, others were not independent enough, yet others had governance issues. And Kurt Hebert was chair then, and Nora and I had just joined the commission, and Kurt suggested that we just fast forward all this, non-uniformity or non-unity, I guess is a better word, with 4 large RTOs in the U.S. Do one in Northeast, Midwest, Southeast, and West. And I wish we'd laid more groundwork, as it would have been the best setup, honestly. But after multilateral settlement talks, it became clear that it just wasn't going to work out for a number of reasons, both political and interpersonal and operational. So we moved ahead with PJM and ISO New England filings at a kind of early 01, 02, getting those designated as RTOs, working through particularly independence and governance issues there toward the end, which were very important and that played out to be important over time. Not quite the sexy top line issues, but important nonetheless. Then, of course, forming MISO and SPP much more from the ground up. And as you see from the map there, those have continued to grow. PJM added on Ohio and Virginia while I was there, kind of reconfiguring the boundary line with MISO, and then MISO is, as you see there, picked up even my hometown down there in the corner of Texas when Entergy joined. Ultimately, there following my service on the commission. Cal ISO and New York ISO never did come together and get the RTO filing done, and I think together with ERCOT, the 3 most populous states, they're effectively are single state RTOs. We've effectively kind of defined them that way as basically RTOs and everything but scope. And at the same time we were looking at all these filings, and in light of what had happened in the California meltdown, we saw the need for more standardization of market design so we could achieve those customer benefits that were on Jim's slide just a minute ago. And when I think about what benefits those were, obviously keeping down transactions costs, reducing the opportunities for gaming, which of course we discovered in spades in the California opaque design, facilitating state retail access programs. Obviously that's important in Texas, that the wholesale market be robust and efficient in the first place so that those savings could then be passed through to customers, and drive down the margins. I think clearly compared to margins under regulation, the margins from markets were substantially lower. Not that generators like that, but it was the promise that we had that markets would actually achieve the correct pricing for all of these things. Inefficient plants have shut down. They continue to be flavors. Old gas, old coal, even nuclear plants have been shut down as more efficient gas and renewables have come on to displace them. So that's how a market's supposed to work. And then, of course, the infrastructure needed to make it all work. Mission, the kind of price signals and the transparency that you get from competitive marketplace. And we saw this on about the 4th hour that MISO was open. We saw redispatch happening in real time. It was fascinating to look at the heat map. So those kind of important data points come out very quickly in a competitive marketplace, and so a lot of that delivery has happened. So effectively, we wanted to put down the best efforts, best practices from all these RTOs, and basically flesh out what Order 2000 prongs did. And so that was the standard market design that you see here on this slide. This is Bill Hogan's surprisingly well written slide. It's worn the test of time and really epitomizes really what the market successful design is about. Of course, there are other aspects dealing with transmission planning that are a very important part of RTO and became an important subsequent action of the later commission. But this was really the core. This having a coordinated spot market in the middle, surrounded by a lot of support structures that I think the audience knows well, but can reread. I think if there's any open question in my mind about where that goes, Rob, it's the fact that we're increasingly, particularly in the Sun Belt, having an increasing penetration of zero variable cost power generation resources, and this will only continue, and it'll expand to the northern markets as well. And so when you've got economic energy price market driving really the core of this, and in a number of the markets have a capacity construct that's separate, we've got to think about how we're going to go forward. And so I've been very intrigued by the discussions that have gone on about having a separately bid clean energy attribute market where you can help rationalize the disparate state goals. It's really easy when this was kind of done from the beginning, that the goal was simply an economic goal. But now we need to also consider these non-economic factors such as carbon intensity that are important to now probably a majority of the states. And so Hogan's drawing might well need to turn into a pentagon ultimately in the years ahead.
All right. Thanks, Pat. And, some of those environmental policy issues and how the state policies interact with wholesale markets, I'll put a plug in for a Resources for the Future seminar tomorrow on the minimum offer price rule. We're not going to do too much on that topic here on this one, or if you're listening on the recording, you can find that also on the rff.org website. No, that's a very helpful sort of current thinking on, what's still true and what may have changed from 15 years ago on RTOs and their market designs. Why don't we move on and hear from John and then Cheryl and get their thoughts on the table, and then come back to a couple of the other topics. John, you took over, and I'd love to get your overall comments on RTOs, both retrospective, but I know you think a lot about the evolving
Rob, I lost you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, repeat just what you said. I took over, and then
Okay.
then I lost you. Right.
Okay. Well, I just go ahead and give your overall impressions. But I know one of the things that came on your plate right at the start was regional transmission planning and cost allocation through RTO tariffs, and if you don't mind shedding some light on that.
Sure. Be happy to do that. Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it. Well, and there was before I took over, I started at FERC in August of 2006, and Joe Kelleher was the chair there. And Joe was very focused on, and much to his credit, did tremendous work on a little piece of legislation that was inserted by Congress in 2005 called the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which had a great deal of work cut out for FERC, which included the reliability organization and FERC ultimately making reliability standards mandatory, and FERC requiring FERC to designate a reliability organization, which they did designate NERC to be that entity. And of course, the RTOs play a huge part in overseeing reliability from a perspective of the operation of those grid systems that they oversee. In addition to that, the 2005 Energy Policy Act and a number of other, I think, very interesting provisions that FERC was required to act on. One of my favorites is Section 1223, which is the section related to advanced transmission technologies, and that section of the 2005 Act actually designated for the first time a number of technologies that were otherwise thought of as, in some instances consumer technologies, and in some instances other technologies that had never been thought of as things that could provide transmission services, but included things like storage, which was specifically called out, distributed generation, and demand response. All those were designated by Congress in 2005 as potentially being transmission technologies to the extent that they could provide transmission services. So moving forward into my tenure at FERC, again, under Joe Kelleher, the first order that related to those technologies and related to the specific duties of the RTOs was Order 890, which was the sort of seminal order on transmission planning that designated regional planning authorities, entities that were determined to be ones that would do the planning for the transmission system, for the bulk electric system, and the RTOs by default were those entities in their regions, and then outside of their regions there had to be formed these regional planning authorities by 3 or more TOs, transmission owners. But under 890, those RTOs were the ones who were given that responsibility. And so ultimately, that defined what that transmission planning structure was to look like, open and transparent planning that allowed for participation by multi-stakeholder parties to come in and propose transmission alternatives, which could include things like these advanced transmission technologies potentially. So it was a very broad order that directed the RTOs and other regional planning authorities to engage in these planning activities on the bulk power system. We then moved from Order 890 to Order 1000 when I was chair. Cheryl was at the commission as well, and we went a couple steps farther in Order 1000, building on Order 890, and then building before that really on the work that our predecessors, Pat and Jim and others, had done with respect to the RTOs. But what we did in Order 1000 was really required that there be a competition in the development of transmission infrastructure for major projects. There were exceptions to that, but major projects are supposed to be ones that are looked at from a competitive perspective. And then in addition, we looked at the interregional coordination issues in Order 1000, trying to at least encourage, and I have to say, looking back on it, there really wasn't a lot of teeth in it, but unfortunately, I think it has not met its promise in that regard with respect to interregional transmission planning and development. But at least the intent was to try to get this look at more interregional transmission activity where you had resources such as high-value renewables in areas that needed to move to loads across one or more regions to hopefully ensure that there be coordination of the planning of those kinds of structures, infrastructure. So those were the two orders, I think, that really advanced what the RTOs were responsible for during the time that I was there at FERC.
That's great, thanks. And we're showing a slide now that gives some assessment of the results from a renewable energy deployment perspective, where really almost exactly half of the wind energy capacity operating in the country can be directly attributable to the regional transmission planning and cost allocation that RTOs did. Any quick comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it does show that planning activities, especially the MISO MVP activity, where there were actually 17 specific projects had an effect of getting a significant amount of new wind developed. Unfortunately, though, I think each one of these, none of these, I think, are an interregional project. They're all intra-regional projects, unfortunately. But within the regions, I think it does illustrate that under Order 890 and Order 1000, there has been significant development, certainly of wind resources within the regions.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you, John. We're going to turn to Cheryl next, and then we'll open it up a little bit and start getting folks questions. Again, you can send your questions in through the webinar software. But Cheryl, you were, it seemed like probably every year or two there was another interconnection queue logjam issue to deal with. So I'd love to have your comments on that. We're showing a slide on remote renewables and population centers and the opportunity to deliver low-cost renewables to the population centers. I know you thought a lot about that, and of course thought a lot about RTOs generally. So I'd love to have your general comments, and then any comments on the interconnection queue and transmission planning issues.
Well, thanks a lot, Rob. And starting more generally, I think when you look at the resource transformations of the past 20 years since Order number 2000, and I would say chronologically, the growth of domestic natural gas and combined cycle technology, all the environmental regulations that help drive the large-scale retirement of coal, and the rapid introduction of renewable generation, I don't believe any of those transformations could have been accomplished in the same way without the regional markets and the regional planning and operation of the transmission system. Before Order 2000, I used to say that you needed one of the big jumbo boxes of Crayola crayons to draw a map of the United States and all of the different companies that plan their own transmission and plan their own generation and operate their own dispatch centers across the country. And if you imagine that each of those colors of crayons was trying to accomplish this, you talk about the interregional themes now. If you imagine that each of those colors of crayons was trying to accomplish this transformation instead of the 7 RTOs we have now, I think it's quite clear that it wouldn't have been accomplished as rapidly and efficiently for customers as it has been. I also think one of the benefits of what our predecessors and also John and I in our time did was the way it's developed has allowed each region to meet specific challenges. So just to call out a few successes, for ISO New England built several $1 billion of transmission in the first decade of this century that essentially eliminated generation congestion. That had been a problem there for decades. PJM was able to seamlessly adapt to MATS after all the brouhaha about the mercury and air toxic standards that drove a tremendous amount of coal to gas switching in PJM, but because they had a market, you never felt a blip. And MISO and SDP, as was shown on chart 9, both built a lot of transmission to connect the wind power in the western part of their regions to the population centers in their eastern part of their regions. Looking today, though, I think there's still a strong need for transmission, particularly when you overlay the climate challenge and the need to continue to connect location-constrained renewables. And partly because it's so hard to agree on and build transmission, as you alluded to, many regions have experienced huge interconnection queues, and they tend to be queues of renewable generators in wind-rich or other resource-rich zones trying to connect to the load centers. And it really suggests the need for additional backbone transmission to renewable regions. And I think part of the reason why, there's clearly a tension between interconnection and transmission. They're both high voltage wires strung up to connect customers, but it's been hard to get states to agree on cost sharing for each other's public policy goals, even within a region. And the incumbent transmission owners, and competition was a big tenet of Order 1000, incumbent owners have been very resistant to transmission competition. So while we're seeing some successes, like the Order 1000 public policy projects that are being built in New York right now, the general implementation of Order 1000 has been harder than we expected. Looking forward, though, I think that the regional planning and the regional markets are going to be even more relevant. than they are now, because I think there's two major drivers of change, both having a climate overlay. The first is the need to connect more generation across bigger geographies. We're seeing this in the West, where they're working in an imbalanced market and talking about going further because they have hugely geographically separate population centers and rich renewable opportunities, hydro, wind, solar, and the need to connect them requires more regionalization than has been present out there before. But the second trend is more localization, almost miniaturization, with people putting storage and demand-side resources and solar behind the meter. And there you're going to need the regional operators to help deploy those resources through digitization in a sensible way, so you get the most benefit for customers. I think both trends, even though the second one might seem to point to more local development, I think both trends really are going to continue to highlight the need for the kind of regional planning that Order Number 2000 started.
Great. That is very helpful. Thank you. And thank you all. We're getting some good questions here, unsurprisingly, but this was a great walk through the history of RTOs, and maybe we can turn a little bit more towards the future and think about these issues that I think each of you touched on about the evolving resource mix. I certainly share the view that we're looking at a high renewable energy future, with or without climate legislation, and that calls for different ways of operating. I think each of you have talked about the need for robust infrastructure and regional markets to make the whole system work in that scenario. Maybe why don't we talk about kind of this macro grid idea and interregional planning, which a couple of you mentioned. Maybe starting with you, Jim Hecker, since John Wellinghoff mentioned that his Order 1000 touched on interregional planning, but perhaps didn't have a lot of teeth. As a policy matter, do you think there are opportunities going forward for the Commission to build on Orders 888, 2000, 890, 1000 to do something new there in the future? And then after Jim, I'd love others' comments on both kind of the infrastructure opportunity of that, interregional transmission and some of these ideas of a high voltage DC grid overlay, as well as the policy angle.
Rob, I think there are enormous opportunities and even responsibilities to begin to explore more transmission investment, and especially of the interregional kind. The trends now, because of many of the factors that Cheryl and John mentioned, are towards greater integration of the bulk power markets and the grid. Renewable energies, its cost competitiveness, the new focus on decarbonization. Competitive markets are in a completely different place than they were 20 years ago. The consumer benefits are palpable if you look at the reports from the various RTOs in terms of reliability benefits, fuel diversity, wind integration, and so forth. Technology is in a different place as well, not just the digital revolution, but new things that I think will make a tremendous difference if we'll let them. High voltage direct current transmission, for example. We have I think we're poised, having wrung the benefits out of Order 1000 and its predecessors. We're now looking ahead to how to get additional benefits, particularly from renewable energy and from bulk power markets that will continue to drive down transaction costs and benefit consumers in some major ways. But there are certain things we need to address, and I think Cheryl made a great case that interregional transmission, expanding and integrating markets, and beginning to look at this industry in a more national way, and to let markets work their will in ways that are not interrupted by artificial boundaries, be they the boundaries of RTOs or states or other obstacles. So I would personally love to have the Commission sit down and think about how we can take all these wonderful precedents a step further, a major step further, in terms of promoting a truly national electric transmission policy and a robust grid.
Great, thanks, Jim. Why don't we just keep going in the order we had before? Pat, do you want to comment on any of that? Pat, you there?
Might be on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Much like FERC's authority in the gas industry, it would really help if Congress gave FERC clearer authority over transmission routing. I think that gives FERC the hammer, so to speak, to get parties to the table to talk about interregional. Certainly they listen to FERC now, but when you've got the authority to actually site the facility, that makes a whole lot of difference. I've long been a supporter of that. Obviously, I've had too many CCNs in my lifetime, and I'm well aware of the impact it has on individuals and property and natural resources and beautiful land and rivers and all that. But we've got to be thinking about the broader picture. If Congress is serious about wanting a truly clean energy grid across the whole country, you got to tap the middle of the country to get that big bulk of cheap, clean energy so that we can keep the lights on and dispatch accordingly. But then that leads to the kind of flip side, which is who pays for it? The issues that certainly hounded me during, and I think every commissioner since, has been a cost allocation. So when you build a big grid, perhaps, or even overlay some HVDC on top of the existing grid to juice it up, then you got the question of how do you allocate those costs? And this was a big issue when I was there, but now as you're looking forward, and Cheryl pointed to the technologies that are going to be that are disruptive and going to be even more so. A lot of people have the ability to actually exit the grid in whole or at least in part. And so the addition of more mandatory costs to finance the HVDC, for example, be slathered on top of them, they might just decide to lead the party. So we've got to be, we can dream big, but we also got to be mindful of the fact that the world is changing really fast.
Yeah, thank you. And that sort of tees up one of the things, John Wellinghoff, that you said about advanced transmission technologies. We certainly also need to build out the grid, but we've got to be very mindful of cost. And you mentioned some new technologies that can help operate the grid more efficiently. But did you want to also follow up on sort of the interregional planning or what might be next?
Yeah, well, and actually I think I wanted to go beyond that, Rob. I mean, sort of going back to first principles, I think, FERC was given very, very specific direction in the 2005 Energy Policy Act about reliability. I think it's now time for Congress to give FERC direction about our climate crisis and how the transmission system is going to address that. And I think it's absolutely incumbent upon the Congress to do something there. I know that there's been the proposal in the Clean Future Act by the House Energy and Commerce Committee. They've got a number of proposals in there, including National RPS and other things. But that act proposal is actually pretty void with respect to transmission policy. And regarding transmission policy, I think it is time for us to develop a national transmission plan. And I think you've got one slide here, Rob, that shows sort of the HVDC overlay that was proposed by NREL a number of years ago. And I know there were a number of other proposals of, national plans for the grid to build it out and develop it in ways that will move these high value renewables to the load centers, and also I think support the types of things that Cheryl was talking about, and that is the distributed generation that's being developed down at the local levels at consumers' premises, and the two kind of go hand in hand. But in doing that, I think we do need more direction from Congress. FERC needs more direction from Congress, needs more help on the cost allocation side, and also on the siting side, as Pat said as well. I mean, without those specific things, I think being addressed in some congressional authorizations, I think FERC is still going to continue to be, moving around the edges of things here. We really need to get beyond that if we're really going to address the climate crisis that we've got before us.
That's helpful. Cheryl, why don't you pick any of the above, but if you wanted to follow up on the interregional or the kind of the macro grid build out and what FERC might be looking at in the future, that'd be welcome.
Well, I certainly agree that if we were to have congressional legislation authorizing a national grid or requiring a national grid, I've often drawn the analogy of Abraham Lincoln with the railroads, which connected the country, and President Eisenhower with the highways, which connected the country. If you had something like that for the interconnected high voltage grid, that would be transformational. That would require, I think, a consensus on the need, on the urgency of the climate challenge that doesn't seem to exist in our political establishment. So I think something much more targeted that Congress could do is reinvigorate the backstop siting that they tried to give FERC in the Energy Policy Act and was more or less negated by the courts. If you look at the Clean Line projects, for example, all of which failed, none of them, I believe, took any customer money or regional cost allocation. They were all privately funded, but it was just the siting disputes at the state and local level that prevented those projects from, any of them, from going forward. They all hit one state that didn't want the HVDC. So I think that's something that might be within our reach to get the backstop siting fixed. Beyond that, it's certainly been several years since FERC took a policy look at this, and I think there's plenty more to do just on regional planning and cost allocation, even before you try to go from interregional coordination to interregional planning. So I think there's always an opportunity among all the many things that FERC is tackling right now to take a look at this. I know we had a tech conference a few years ago. That record's pretty stale, but there's certainly more that could be done.
Yeah, thanks for that. And John mentioned a slide. We actually took it out of the version we used, but if anybody's interested in that kind of macro grid idea and the visual, if you go on the Americans for a Clean Energy Grid website and look up the SEAM study, there's some information there, including a PowerPoint presentation that includes a lot of visuals from the analysis that the National Renewable Energy Lab did, and it I would say it's one of a number of these kind of broad macro national system models that looked at the actual output profile of wind and solar, where the resources are, what times of day they operate, and that sort of thing, and then match that up with load and figure out what's needed. And in every analysis of that sort that's been done, they find a need for a significant expansion of regional and interregional transmission, as well as the models effectively assume that you have an RTO because they're allowing power to freely flow without paying pancaked rates and all those sorts of things. So essentially the models are saying we need RTOs as big as we can get them, and transmission planning as big and wide as we can get that, which brings me to one more question. We hear a lot from consumers I think a lot of the new corporate sort of technology-related consumers are very supportive of RTOs, and they want the choice that brings in access to renewables. But we also hear broadly from a lot of consumers that they're concerned about some things that happen in RTOs related to cost. So I'm going to throw you a curveball. I didn't give any of you a heads up about sort of governance of RTOs, because it just occurs to me that as I listen to each of you, we're talking about a pretty ambitious, new, if anything, expanded role of an RTO-like entity, but I'm not sure we're totally there yet in terms of consumers' trust in what all of the RTOs are doing. Do any of you care to comment on how do we make sure? Is it a change in the governance to change the voting of RTOs, or some other way to build up more trust in them?
Pat, I was thinking about this, and I thought, well, we won't get onto this in this call, but you did. One thing that I was always kind of, and I say this with a bit of trepidation with my colleagues on the phone here, but one thing I've really lost in the middle with both my commissioners and FERC staff was the need to have a fully independent member board. And because of my personal experience with the mixed board at ERCOT and the SPP, and I wonder sometimes if maybe that check on kind of mission creep or inefficient practices might be a bit ameliorated if you did have a mixture of market participants, particularly ones from the C-suite. I think the higher up on the deck they are, the more likely, in my experience, they've been to think more broadly than just what benefits their own company. I mean, clearly that's the ill that we wanted to address by having fully independent boards. But, I don't want to, fight on that hill if it's not worth it. But I just think that's worth considering, of having a bit more of the people who are paying the bills sit around the table.
Yeah, governance has always been a struggle since the days of C-Trans and Grid Florida all the way up through current RTOs. I think we've fallen somewhat short of that Order 2000 criteria of true independence, and I certainly agree with Pat that it remains a live issue. And if we were to have additional RTOs or other such institutions emerge, I think that would be something to pay particular attention to.
I think there's a lot in your question to unpack. I certainly think that the demand on the part of companies for cleaner energy, whether they're the data centers or the Amazon doing their search or the manufacturers that are taking clean energy pledge, is being felt in corporate boardrooms. And I've heard that from utility CEOs that that's partly driving decision making. And so I think that consumer demands for more clean energy is driving state policy and utility decision making as well. I don't think that actual consumers, rank and file people who pay electric bills, think very much about RTOs. And I base that on the fact that when I was nominated for FERC in 2010, I spent the next several months telling everyone other than people who were in the energy industry what FERC was. No one had ever heard of it. And now I've had the exact same experience being elected to the board of ISO New England. I was at a baby shower yesterday, and the couple of people who asked me what I had been working on, these were intelligent, college-educated, newspaper-reading people, had not heard of ISO New England. So I think consumers are more focused on their bills and the choices that are being made on their behalf, all of which are partly shaped at the regional level, partly at the state level. I think right now there's a major issue in the relationships between the regional organizations and the state policymakers, and that's going to be a significant issue as they work through resource choices right now.
Well, and Robin, I think one other thing we need to remember and perhaps to the extent that there is criticism of the costs of the RTOs, is that the benefits that those RTOs bring far exceed those costs. I mean, you can look at the West, for example, and the EIM, the energy imbalance market there, and the cost savings that that's brought to each individual utility service territory where a utility has joined the EIM. If they weren't in the EIM, the consumers are paying, $60 to $100 million more by joining the EIM. Simply by joining what is, an RTO light in essence, by associating with and allowing CAISO to run that EIM for them. So we have to get the story out better, as we did to get Entergy to join MISO ultimately. And now Entergy touts all the savings that they're achieving by being a member of MISO. That RTOs are extremely cost effective for consumers.
Great point.
That's helpful. Somebody pointed out to me on these governance issues that, Pat, in your standard market design, one of the many gems in there, I think, was a redesign of the stakeholder process and governance. That was one of many things that did not get passed, but it's still out there as a resource for people.
Well, just because it wasn't accepted doesn't mean it's not a good idea. We're actually time has proven a lot of that to be well worn. Again, it was really an attempt. Standard market design was an attempt to get the best practices in one compendium, so we didn't have to keep fighting the same battle again and again. And we fought the same battle again and again, but we got to the end game, and obviously learned a lot more as industries evolved over time. But God, the billions of dollars we could have saved. But that's not the way this works, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I think all four of you have mentioned FERC's limited authority ultimately to force what may be abundantly clear to be the right answer, and the need for perhaps some more guidance from Congress. And maybe we'll turn to the last question as we wrap up. But sort of you could take it either two ways. One is, there is a House bill we're about to see that includes an RTO mandate in there. And I think the more people, and this is coming from House Democrats who are focused obviously a lot on climate change, and so I think the more people think about a decarbonized grid, the more they'll come around to the need for RTOs everywhere. So whether it's forced or whether each region just evolves towards that on their own, I guess the question is, do you think we'll effectively eventually have an RTO in each region? If we have energy imbalance markets spreading across the West, and if we have discussions about something like that in the Southeast, and RTO study bills in each of the Carolinas, anyone care to venture out where we might be 5 or 10 years down the road?
It's hard to think, Rob, after all the economic carnage that happened in the Southeast, if people don't, figure out that an organized market's a damn good way to get transparency on future investment. We can't repeat those mistakes again, where you've got the utility-driven investment that's getting no market check at all. So, at a minimum, the energy imbalance market concept, or what we always call the day one market, clearly makes sense across the country, even in the vertically regulated areas of the country like the Southeast is, and in the non-California West. Obviously we tried to make it mandatory. Jim tried to make it mandatory. The politics of that are tough. So, at the end of the day, the economic arguments sell this, and it's really just going to have to be articulation over the vested interests of the parties who are going to be hurt by competition. The good guys have to be louder. And so, clearly what I think each of us are doing in our own way, but in our post-FERC careers. But I think really the economic arguments of RTOs are established now. We've got a track record, we've got history, we've got facts, and those really should continue to be, and that's why I'm advocating in those regions you've talked about. I'm out there doing it, explaining to people why that is where they need to go. But I think persuasion is where we've got to go. The politics of this probably haven't changed at the congressional level, so we've got to win their hearts.
Well,
I think what's so powerful. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Cheryl. No, go ahead.
I think what's so powerful in the West right now is the greater regionalization through the energy imbalance market and the potential day-ahead market is organically developing in the West through the needs of those states. So it's not something that's imposed by FERC or imposed by Congress, which would probably almost certainly be opposed. It's something that's developing organically there, which hopefully, although it's slower, will make it more successful. I'm a big believer in RTOs. I'd love to see that happen in the Southeast as well, but I think that I'm not sure that a congressional bill that required it, which is just going to bring out the power marketing administrations and so forth in opposition, I'm not sure that's a battle I would pick. I'd like to see it happen organically, and I think we're already seeing that.
I certainly endorse that. I would have mandated it 20 years ago. I think we're in a different place now. The trends are towards integration, and I think the EIMs and the SPP's EIS proposals are all an indication that the markets and the physical grid are going to begin to integrate in ways that that will be demanded by environmental requirements, by state public policy, and by consumer demand.
Well,
John, you got the last word.
I guess I've always been one who likes to pick battles, but I try to pick the battles that are worth fighting. I think it is fundamentally worth fighting to make RTOs mandatory. They can grow organically and grow across the country, but still be voluntary. And I think we still would have then a fundamental flaw in the system, and that's the relationship between the RTO management, their board, and the RTO members. If those members are voluntary and can say anytime to the management board, well, we don't like what you're doing, goodbye, we're out of the RTO, then you've got a relationship where those managers and that board are going to have a very different view of how they view their job and they proceed with their job than if instead you have a mandatory requirement that every TO has to be in an RTO. I think it's a fight worth picking. I think we ought to pick it. I think we ought to win it. If we do, I think we'll be better off for it.
That's a great way to end. This has been absolutely fantastic. I want to thank each of the four of you. We've had a lot of questions. I've tried to reflect the audience questions in my own. We did have some questions on this minimum offer price rule, which is the controversial issue related to state policy. We don't have time to get to it. I mentioned there is a resources for the future event tomorrow morning. You could check that out, but that issue could have consumed this whole conversation, and I wanted to talk more broadly about RTOs as we just have. One other just factoid, there's also an interregional transmission planning bill in Congress that Senator Heinrich has led, and there's conversations in both chambers and with potential other sponsors. So on the guidance related to interregional planning, hopefully that will move forward and give some more guidance to FERC going forward. With that, we're out of time. Thank you so much to everybody who called in or who is listening to the recording, and thanks to our four great panelists. If folks want to keep sending in any comments or questions, we can try to post some material related to this, and please stay connected with Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks.